I'd like to begin today by giving you kind of an introduction to the philosopher that we're starting off this class with. A philosopher who's been extremely influential in Western history, one who has written a great many number of works that are still being analyzed today that continue to inform philosophy classes such as yourself. We're looking at Plato today. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was said to be the student of Socrates, and he's one of the most influential philosophers ever. He wrote on a great number of topics, including social and political theory, knowledge, metaphysics, what justice is, what love is. And he had an interesting writing style. He portrayed all of this stuff through dialogues. Dialogues between different characters meant to evince certain points, certain philosophical points. The essay that we're going to be looking at today, which I think is a great starting point for introductory to philosophy classes, is known as the Allegory of the Cave. This essay comes from a book that Plato wrote known as The Republic, which you may or may not have heard of, a masterclass in political philosophy, in which Plato tries to explain and argue for what he thinks is the ideal form of socioeconomic organization. This essay comes from like 75% of the way through the book, and it is Plato's way of trying to explain to the other characters and the other readers of this text, whoever's going to read it later, what the purpose of philosophy is, why we do it, and why it should have such a central role in how we organize ourselves and engage in human life. Can you all read that? Is it legible enough? Okay, good. I'm faster if I write in cursive, but I learned that a lot of people can't read my cursive handwriting anymore. The reason why this essay is a great starting point for introduction to philosophy classes is because it really encapsulates what philosophers are trying to do in their various writings. What the purpose of philosophy is, why we might think philosophy is important at all. So I'd like to pose a question to all of you before we actually get into the story itself. I assume you all did the reading for today. If you didn't, just try to be quiet and not draw any attention to yourself. What is this story about? Can somebody summarize it for us? Right, yeah. What I'd like to do, just so you all have a clear idea of what is being represented here, is I'd like to play a short video for y'all. That was an excellent summary, but it's not clear exactly by the language what this situation is supposed to look like and what's going on. So I'm just going to play a brief animated video for you now so you can get a better sense of what exactly is Plato describing here. And then we'll talk about the significance of the story as well as what it means for our lives. Sound good? Okay. Try not to fall asleep. This is an older video, but it's a good one.
Let me show in a parable to what extent our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Envision human figures living in an underground cave with a long entrance across the whole width of the cave. Here they've been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads around. Above and behind them, a fire is blazing at a distance. They see only their own shadows, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. For how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a raised way and a low wall built along the way like the screen which puppet players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. Do you see men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of articles which they hold projected above the wall? Statues of men and animals made of wood and stone and various materials? Of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows. And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? And suppose further that there was an echo which came from the wall. Would they not be sure to think when one of the passers-by spoke that the voice came from the passing shadows? To them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. And now look again and see what will naturally follow if one of the prisoners is released. At first, when he is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his head round and look towards the light, all this would hurt him, and he would be much too dazzled to see distinctly those things whose shadows he had seen before. And then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion. But that now, when he's approaching nearer to reality and his eyes turn toward more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not think that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. He will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. And first he will see the shadows best. Next, the reflections of objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the stars and the spangled heavens, and the light of the moon. He will see the sky and the stars by night. Last of all, he will be able to see the sun. And not mere reflections of it in the water, but he will see the sun in its own proper place, and not in another. And he will contemplate the sun as it is. Will he not then proceed to argue that it is the sun who gives the season and the years, and is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things which his fellows have been accustomed to behold? Surely he would first see the sun, and then reason about it. And when he remembered his old habitation and what was the wisdom of the cave and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would bless himself for the change? Pity them. And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were the quickest to observe the passing shadows, and to remark which of them went before and which followed after, and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honors and glories, or envy the possessors of them? Would he not say with Homer, "Better to be the poor servant of a poor master, and to endure anything rather than think as they do, and live after their manner"? Imagine once more such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? And if there were a contest of measuring the shadows, and he had to compete with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, wouldn't they all laugh at him and say he had spoiled his eyesight by going up there? That it was better not to even think of ascending? And if anyone tried to release another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. It is the task of the enlightened not only to ascend to learning and to see the good, but to be willing to descend again to those prisoners and to share their troubles and their honors, whether they are worth having or not. And this they must do, even with the prospect of death. They shall give of their help to one another, wherever each class is able to help the community.
Okay. So there are a lot of things that are going on in that story. A lot of things that Plato was trying to do here. I'm going to explain a few of them to you, and then we're going to walk through the one that is more applicable to what we're going to be doing in this class. Because Plato is doing several things in this story. First, some historical context for you. Plato wrote this book, The Republic, after the Athenians had suffered a terrible loss in the Peloponnesian War. If you've played video games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, for example, you may know this historical event. They were basically crushed by the Spartans, okay? And Plato saw their defeat as being a product of how politics was going on at the time in Athens, okay? He basically saw that this democratic way of doing things was not resulting in good things for the Athenian people. The rulers, or so-called rulers, were lining their own pockets. They weren't looking out for the public good. They weren't doing what was knowledgeable or wise or best for the community. And Plato had real problems with this. So he laid a lot of the reasons for why they lost the war on how they were politically organizing themselves. and the laws that were being passed and how they were being carried out. So one of the things that I think Plato is doing in this story is he's expressing that point. He's basically telling his readers, look at what has happened to us. Look at what has happened to our city as a result of dumb people not doing what they should be doing. Dumb people being in positions of power. People who are stuck in the metaphorical cave, so to speak, who don't have the right priorities, who don't see reality as it is, who are not doing what's good for the community. So that's one interpretation that you can have. Another interpretation that is relevant to what we're doing in this class is the general point that Plato is trying to make with regards to the situation that we are all in as people who have limited logical and sensory faculties. Okay? What Plato is basically telling us throughout this story is that until we start reflecting on our beliefs, until we start investigating what we observe and what is told to us, we are like those prisoners that are trapped within the cave. We are living in a world of illusion because we cannot know if what we know is true or not. We haven't actually investigated for ourselves. We haven't thought through these things. That is the overall point. We are all in this situation in which we can only come to knowledge of the truth if we actually, Plato thinks, engage in philosophy. So that's what he sees the purpose of philosophy is doing. Getting us to reflect on our beliefs and trying to uncover the nature of reality. Not just what is being fed to us by the media or by our parents or by the church, by politicians, whatever it is. Does that make sense? Okay. So, to recap, let's just talk about the structure of the story. And then we can connect it more applicably to areas in our life in which we can see that Plato is actually right. Okay? So what's the overall structure? Well, he presents to us this image of cave dwellers being trapped within this world of illusion. Right? They're looking at shadows on walls, but they've never left this cave. They don't know what's going on in the outside world, right? They're basically having a narrative spoon-fed to them, and they come to believe that this is the way reality actually is. But what happens in the story? Well, one of them actually manages to escape, right? He manages to somehow look around and turn around and see what's going on. He sees the fire. He sees the puppets, right, being carried along the walkway. He sees that they're projecting shadows on the wall. And he decides to leave, right? Or rather, we might say he is led by the hand by somebody else to leave. Like an educator might lead you by the hand to a better understanding of a concept. Or your parents might lead you by the hand, right, to a better understanding of how the world works, especially when you're a kid, right? Because you don't know anything. The person who is able to escape the cave, who is led from the cave, realizes that what he's been looking at this whole time has not been an accurate picture of reality. And then what happens? Well, he leaves the cave, but does he have an easy time figuring out what things are and what things look like? What happens to this escaped prisoner? Yeah.
Once he gets back, he gets laughed at, taunted.
Yeah, that comes later. But what happens right after he leaves the cave? Yes.
His eyes hurt.
His eyes hurt. Why? It's so bright. Symbolically, what might that be? What might that mean?
What he learns is too overpowering and not what he used to.
Right, it's not what he's used to. Right? Whenever somebody is given the truth about something and they've been conditioned into this other way of seeing and believing in things, it hurts them. Right? They're not ready to look at it. They're not ready to take it on board. Well, the same thing happens to the prisoner. Right? After he leaves the cave, he experiences pain because he's not used to seeing things in this way. He's not used to grasping things in this way. And it completely shatters his worldview. Right? Because he was used to the cave his whole life, however long he was in there, and now he's being shown this whole other world that has a completely different set of rules. And so, he's in pain. He suffers a little bit. We might say that his eyes feeling pain because of the brightness is similar to the way that our minds suffer as a result of apprehending a truth that we're not ready to grasp, that we're not ready to look at, right? Well, then what happens? He's kind of grasping around. Slowly his eyes, his mind is starting to adjust to this new way of seeing things, of understanding things. He kind of starts trying to apprehend this new reality, right? He begins his journey towards obtaining an accurate picture of what's going on and why. But he doesn't get to the truth right away, right? What are some of the first things that he's only able to look at because of how bright it is out there?
He looks at the shadows and the reflections of the things outside.
Exactly. What might we liken shadows and reflections to in the story in our journeys to truth? It might help to think, if you're scientifically minded, it might help to think about Newton's laws. Does anybody know what Newton's laws are in physics? And if they're totally true? Yeah. Every action produces an equal and opposite reaction, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. This stuff works for like normal objects, but not quantum particles. So we can say Newton's laws are something of a model or an approximation for how the majority of things work in the universe. It's the same thing with the prisoner's journey to truth and our journeys to truth. We start with models and approximations because that gives us a better grasp. We can't apprehend the whole truth by itself right away. Like, for example, when you asked where babies came from the first time from your parents, and they said, oh, when a mommy and a daddy love each other, they do something, and then a baby starts growing in mommy's tummy, right? That's an approximation, right? That's not the complete, total truth of how things work, right? It's the same thing that the prisoner is undergoing here. He's only able to look at the reflections of things first. He can't apprehend the whole truth first. He has to kind of work his way there. That's kind of what we're doing in our philosophy classes, sociology classes, mathematics, physics classes. We start with models and approximations, and as we become conditioned to this way of thinking about things, we start to apprehend the truth more and more and more. as we continue our journey. Well, eventually he is able to look at things directly, right? Out there outside of the cave. He's actually able to apprehend reality. And that's great. In the story, that is supposed to be symbolic of him understanding the way that things actually works, as opposed to, what was going on in the cave, which was just a world of illusion, right? But then what happens in the story? After he's got a grasp on how things work and why, he's actually able to look at reality the way that it is and grasp it, what does he do? Where does he go? Yeah, he goes back into the cave, right? Why does he go back into the cave? Or why might somebody go back into the cave?
There's the inherent want to educate those that were left behind.
Right. I mean, just imagine or think about what you are like in your own life when you discover something that's amazing. When you figure out something about yourself or your childhood trauma or something, what do? You're like, Brianna, guess what I discovered? Right? Guess what I learned about myself? You want to tell other people what you have learned. You want to share your knowledge with others. That's what this guy tries to do, right? But what does that involve? That involves leaving reality in some sense and going back into the cave, going back into a place or a domain that is not completely lit up by the light of truth. Okay? Or you could think about it this way. Let's say you're having a political conversation with your parents, okay? And you're trying to explain to them why you think, this policy is bad. How are you going to do that? Well, you can't use all of the language and the terminology that you learned in school, especially if they didn't get an education like you did. You need to kind of use their language. You need to appeal to their worldview in some sense. A worldview which you might think is limited or whatever it is, right? That doesn't capture the complete truth. So, I think what Plato is kind of getting at with this little detail is oftentimes when we try to express what we've learned or express knowledge to others, that requires us to give people a model or an approximation and not the full truth, especially if they're not at the same point on their journey to truth that we are. What do you think? Does that make sense? Okay, but anyway, he goes back into the cave, right? And you can imagine what he says. He's like, guys, like, all these shadows on the wall, there's so much more than that, right? Have you guys even turned your heads around? No, right? Of course they haven't, because they're enslaved. They can't do anything. They're stuck. Their heads are chained in one direction. And what do? He's telling them about all these things that he saw out there, all these things that he's learned, about how he's apprehended reality, he's seen it, he knows what's actually going on. What is their response?
They laugh.
They laugh at him, right? Why do they laugh? Why do you think they laugh? Yes?
Because it conflicts with what they know as reality, so therefore what he's saying sounds fake and not real, and like he's making it up.
Right. They're living according to a completely different worldview, right? So when he's trying to explain to him how he sees things, they're not getting it and they think it's ridiculous, right?
Plus, his eyes aren't adjusted to the darkness anymore, so from what they understand, he's kind of rendered useless.
That's a great point. Yes. His eyes are not adjusted, right? He's not used to seeing the world in the way that they do. He's not used to living according to the policies and norms that they are, right? He's uncovered a different way of life, a different way of seeing things. They think he's full of shit. Okay? Because they haven't seen what he's seen. They can't even imagine it. They don't know any other world. All the experiences that they've been having have involved looking literally at shadows on a wall. Right? They haven't seen a flower. They haven't seen the sun. They haven't seen stones or water or anything like that. But the situation gets worse than this, right? They don't just laugh at him. What do they do next? Imagine he keeps on pushing them. He's like, no, listen, you got to listen to me. Okay, I'm telling you, this world isn't all that there is. There's another way of looking at things. There are other things out there. Eventually, they get tired of listening to him, and what do? Yeah, is that what you were going to say? They kill him, right? They kill our poor escaped prisoner who feels like he understands now the universe and the secrets of the universe and stuff. And you will understand where Plato gets this idea from if you've ever tried to talk to your friends or family members who you think are ideologically possessed or dogmatic or anything like that, right? You can't get through to them. And they react defensively. And maybe they push you away. Maybe they say hurtful things, right? People have been killed for a lot less throughout human history, right? Saying the wrong thing at the wrong time has landed a lot of people in bad situations. Plato is actually getting at something else here that has to do with his historical time period. One of the things that's been going on at this time is not only that the Athenians have suffered this loss in war, but also that philosophy as a practice is beginning to be looked down upon. At the same time as there are people walking around claiming to be philosophers who want to spread the truth to people and open their eyes, there's a whole other group of people called the sophists who aren't training people in how to see reality and what reality is like in science and mathematics, but they're teaching people how to use words to get what they want, basically. What we might call rhetoric. And so public opinion of philosophers at this time is not great. And perhaps what Plato is also getting at here is he's nodding to the fate of his mentor, Socrates. Does anybody know what happened to Socrates? Are you familiar with Socrates' life and ultimate death? Socrates was a guy who walked around Athens basically asking questions of people. He's like, hey, I'm trying to figure out what justice is. Do you know what justice is? And people are like, well, I think justice is this. And he's like, well, I don't know about that, because if you consider this, it can't be that, because of this argument right here. And they'd be like, oh, shit. Yeah, I guess you're right. Socrates walked around Athens, and the rulers of the time basically thought he was confusing a bunch of people and undermining their knowledge and turning the youth against those who were in power. So what did they end up doing to Socrates? Well, they charged him with these crimes of blaspheming against the gods, turning the youth against the old and wise rulers, basically undermining political authority and the stories of the times and the knowledge of the times. They put him on trial, and he was found guilty of all these things, and he was sentenced to death. Socrates, the good and wise philosopher, accepted this ruling and drank the hemlock and died. And Plato never got over that. He was very upset about that. One of his best friends, his mentor, his whole project he thought was misunderstood by those around him. He was accused of things he didn't do, and he was ultimately killed for it. So Plato, I think, is also getting at here this idea that not only was his mentor killed as a result of doing philosophy and spreading philosophy, but perhaps he's worried about his own fate. Perhaps he's worried about the fate of those who are on this journey to truth above all else, who don't care about worldly possessions or material goods or political power. Things don't look good for those people, I think Plato is thinking in the back of his mind. And he wishes things would be different. But, alas, he's stuck in this city, surrounded by people that he thinks are stupid, who don't understand what's going on, who don't understand philosophy, and who want to remain ignorant to why things are as bad as they are in Athens. So, that is the basic story. Let's now just put on the board what all of this stuff is supposed to be symbolic of, even though we've talked about it a few times here. Let's connect this back to our lives, to our situation, not just talk about how this is related to what's going on in Athens at the time. What do you think the cave is supposed to represent? I've been calling it a world of illusion this whole time. Can we get a little bit more specific about that? What do you think the cave is supposed to represent here? Any ideas? Yeah.
People's limited purviews in church or just religion in general?
It could be. Yeah, I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like society in general.
Could we get a little bit more specific?
Like how it was like so dark down there, like they were all looking at sideways.
Yeah, maybe you could say it's reflective of like the situations that people are trapped in, like normal people in society, right? Plato has a few different things going on with this symbol. One of the things that he's going to say it is the cave is the material world of the senses, just trying to use our senses to understand things, our sight, taste, hearing, smell, and touch. Why? Because our senses can deceive us sometimes, and they don't always actually get us to reality, right? Mirages exist. Sometimes you feel your phone vibrate in your pocket and you didn't get a notification, right? Sometimes you hear something late at night in your dorm room and you're like, what the fuck is that? It's nothing, right? So one of the things that Plato has going on throughout this whole book is he's talking about how our senses can't be trusted, so we should rely more on our reasoning and our logical faculties to apprehend truth. That's part of it. People who just believe everything that's told to them, believe everything they smell, taste, see, and touch, aren't actually getting to the foundations of things. We might say it represents human life without philosophy and reflection. And thus, going off of this, we might say it represents the state that people are in when they are ideologically possessed, or religiously possessed, or politically possessed, right? They can't see outside of their own political framework, or their own religious framework, or their own just ideological framework in general, right? The cave, in a sense, is supposed to represent a sort of stuckness, People who are stuck in their ways, stuck in their ways of seeing things, stuck believing in these narratives without actually looking at the other side or other perspectives or looking at all the data and evidence. And people can really become possessed by anything, right? It doesn't have to be Christianity or conservatism. It can be progressivism. It can be Buddhism. It can be the scientific worldview, which often argues that everything at bottom is just atoms and energy, right? It is the place that people are in if they're not reflecting on their own beliefs, if they're not reflecting on what they're being told, if they're not investigating things for themselves. And so if that's the cave, who are the cave dwellers? Any idea?
The government.
Maybe. Yeah. It could be. People?
People who are ignorant and truth.
Yeah.
Sycophants.
Yeah. Basically, it's anybody who is just like not thinking about things. People who are mindless. Okay? That's basically the cave dwellers. Honestly, your average person. Right? Does your average person question what they're being told on CNN or Fox News? No, they just consume it, right? And then they watch The Bachelor. Right? That's it. So we could say, honestly, like normal people, oftentimes. But really, it's those who don't reflect on what they're told. Those who don't reflect on their beliefs. Those are the cave dwellers. And they will do some crazy things in order to maintain their own sense of security, in order to maintain their belief in their worldviews. Right? We can all empathize with this. Right? There are truths that we don't want to look at. We have all been in situations in which we were possessed by an idea or an ideology or a framework. We are not above this, okay? Everybody does this. It's just a question of scale. How much do we do this? According to Plato, we should try to do this as less as we can. Fewest amount of times possible. And so who's the escapee? What is the person who escapes? What are they supposed to represent?
Being open-minded.
Yeah. What were you going to say? Oh, the person who's open-minded. Yeah. It's even more than that. But that's an incredibly important part of it.
Someone who's enlightened.
Yeah. Yeah. We might not even say enlightened, though, if enlightened is like something that happens a lot later on your journey, right?
Someone who's educated.
Perhaps. I'm thinking more of a disposition, less of a state.
Like inquisitive.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the person who's willing to go there. The person who's willing to entertain alternative perspectives. The person who's willing to listen to what others have to say, and they take it as an opportunity to learn. They don't take it as an opportunity just to criticize the other person, right? Or make themselves feel better. For Plato, it's going to be the philosopher.
It does talk about like the guiding hand or whatever. It's like, let's say he was forced outside or whatever. So
Yeah.
do you think that he would leave on his own?
What do you think?
Well, no.
Do people leave their echo chambers on their own? Is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. Oftentimes, though, people are dragged out of where they're mentally stuck, right? Oftentimes, it takes a friend to shake you out of your possession, or a family member, or maybe you're that person for somebody else, and you've opened them up to a whole new way of seeing things, a whole new perspective. People can get unstuck on their own. Yeah, Oftentimes, though, it's somebody else who's helping them get unstuck in that way. Yeah. We can say that the escapee is the person seeking after truth. They're open-minded, inquisitive. They have a disposition towards trying to figure out the way reality works. And so in the cave, and we are all stuck in caves, mind you. We're all stuck in many caves. Illusions abound. True knowledge is not knowledge of what people say knowledge is, or what you're told in the media, or even what your parents tell you, whatever. It's something that, at least according to Plato, you have to apprehend for yourself after a careful study and investigation and reflection.
So, in a sense, could this all be compared to Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces? Or just like...
Sure. Yeah, you can imagine this journey to truth as the hero's journey.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. There's certainly obstacles on our way to discovering the truth, right? It's certainly difficult. Yeah. So what are the takeaways here? What are we supposed to learn as a result of this story? What do y'all think? What did you get from the story? Yeah.
And why, also I thought about how do we learn, how are we told that is everything that we're doing just crystal mind, including really basic simple stuff that we're coming on. Is that part of it, or is there a higher way of thinking about simple stuff, or is it just the more broad ideas that we can philosophize, I guess?
Yeah.
Is ignorance actually bliss, or is knowledge bliss? Which side of it?
That's a hard one, right? Yeah. Sometimes I wish I could be ignorant of a lot of things, but I can't. Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of cheap stuff on Wish and Temu. That's cool. But I know I'm supporting sweatshops somewhere if I buy from those apps, right? Oh, God, how I wish I didn't know that. Because then it makes me feel bad if I buy stuff, Or it's like, shoot, Amazon is so convenient. I love that Prime 2-day shipping, right? But those workers they don't have the best working conditions, Do I want to give my money to a company that treats their workers like that? It's like an eternal battle, right? Yeah. Anything else?
I have a lot of stuff. I'm really sorry.
No, that's fine.
How does your belief shadow your full knowledge? If you're religious, can you still be a philosopher? Can you still reach an enlightenment without overarching the rules that you already believe in, or do you have to completely shed that idea and just be completely open-minded?
That's a hard one.
People are scared of knowledge, which is kind of an obvious one, but more how do people just completely ignore the truth? When we came back to the cave, they just ignored him, and they made up kind of BS reasons, oh, your eyes don't work, so obviously you're lying.
Yeah. Oh, and you can imagine why, for them, it would make sense to feel and think that the way that they are, right? They haven't seen what he's seen. They have not been pulled out of their stuckness, right? They're still there. That's the world that they know, right? Yeah.
I kind of resonated with the part where it was talking about how after he saw the sun, he had these assumptions that he could make about the sun, that it's the center of the universe, the cause of pretty much everything he was seeing.
Right.
I thought that was really interesting because as a person, as just a learner, I like to apply what I learn into other aspects of my life. So when I see something like that, it's super helpful to me. So
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting.
And that idea of what the escapee learns actually has to do with Plato's personal philosophy. To try to simplify it for you, he thinks that everything that exists in reality is like a reflection of something that exists in this other realm, the realm of the forms that are perfectly good and complete, but we can't apprehend the realm of the forms, like except through reason and philosophy. And in Plato's philosophy, it's the sun that gives rise to all the other forms, and so there's some stuff going on there. But as far as our own scientific views go, religious views, political views, we don't worship the sun as a god anymore, right? We don't think the sun gives rise to everything in the universe. And so maybe we could say, we should scrutinize the escapee's conclusions a little bit because maybe he's entered another cave, right? By jumping to conclusions like that about the sun, right? Shut up about the sun. Okay.
I thought that there were two really interesting takeaways. One, the question that I was left with to reflect on was let's say I were the guy who got out. Would I, in going back to the cave and being scrutinized, would I just let my eyes readjust and try and build myself up within the cave? Or
Yeah.
Do you go back out and experience that world and keep trying?
That's a hard question to answer, right? It's like trying to answer what would you do in a situation where you have to sacrifice your best friend to save your mom or something? It's like we all have an answer that we would want to give, but when actually faced with a difficult situation like that, especially, if the people that you're trying to offer a new perspective to are not going to be happy about it, and they might persecute you, that's a difficult thing. Yeah. One of the things that we get from all of this, at least from Plato's perspective, is he says that humans have an innate drive towards understanding things, towards the truth. It's just a question of how strong this drive is. For some people it's strong, like himself and Socrates and Aristotle and other philosophers. For some people it's not so strong. They're content consuming various things and chasing pleasure throughout their life. This is a basic point, but it's an important one. Plato is trying to impress upon us here that there is a difference between reality and appearance. Just because something appears to you to be a certain way doesn't mean it actually is that way, right? What philosophy is attempting to do, according to Plato, is get behind the appearance to figuring out the way things actually are. Another thing we can take away from this story is knowledge is powerful, but perhaps dangerous, right? Can you all read that, or is that too cursive-y? Yes?
Could this be comparable to traditionalism versus progressivism?
Maybe. Well, what do you have in mind?
More of don't stay in your mindset of, religion, politics, everything like that, versus the transition of trying to learn new things or expect new things. Matrix, Alice in Wonderland type stuff. Red pill, blue pill.
Sure.
All the above. Yeah.
Sure. I think Plato is cautioning us from becoming stuck in our ideas and our perspectives unless we're certain that we've landed on the truth, which is a difficult thing to know.
Sure.
There are certainly truths in all political ideologies, right? And there's certainly wisdom and truth to be gained from our ancestors, even if we don't completely agree with their worldview. That's actually one of the things that Plato is doing in this book as well, is he's trying to walk a middle path between thinking about things more progressively while accepting and respecting the wisdom that has been handed down to him from tradition, that his education is based on. Right? Picking the best of both worlds to create a new way of life. Finally, we might say this. This is a big takeaway. There are caves everywhere, and we're probably in one or more caves ourselves. We should not assume that we are the only one not in a cave. Okay? Do you understand completely the way the universe works? Do you know for a fact that everything your parents believe is wrong? Do you know for a fact that everything that your celebrity idol believes is correct? No, right? Part of the journey to truth is having some epistemic humility. Assuming that there are things that others can teach you. Not assuming that you have a complete grasp on reality. If we did think that we completely understood the way the world worked, why the hell are you getting an education in the first place? There'd be no point to it. But we don't, right? There are a lot of things that we don't understand, a lot of things that we haven't experienced. Perhaps we should see our interactions with others as opportunities to learn and to share our knowledge in a loving and respectful way. Maybe that would be a cool way to live. I don't know. But furthermore, and this is kind of a deep point, we might argue that the models, words, categories, institutions, and media that we use make up caves themselves. And I'll explain what that means here in a second. You have a certain view of the world. You have a certain lens through which you view the world, a certain framework. That framework includes certain words, certain concepts. But these words and these concepts and these ideas are not the things in themselves that are out there. Right? We have a word for this, mug. We have a word for this, laptop. But the word is not the thing. Right? Likewise, the categories that we use, the models we use, the concepts that we use in our daily lives, they are not the things themselves. So we need to be careful that the words, the language, the models, the frameworks, the concepts that we use don't trap us within caves. There's something to be said about directly experiencing the way reality works without getting caught up in significations and ideas that other people feed to us, right? Taking this a step further, we might say that within our society, various institutions, even educational institutions, governmental institutions, media institutions, they themselves also make up and form various caves. You're not going to get the full picture watching any news station, right? There's only a limited amount of things that they can report on. And we know that their reporting is biased in terms of producing negative emotion because that sells, right? So, we need to be careful with the information we consume. We need to be careful with the frameworks that we apply to our understanding of the world because maybe our framework is not holistic. So we should interrogate the very tools that we use to express truths themselves. Any final comments, questions, or concerns? I think that about covers it. This is what we're going to be trying to do in this class. We're going to try to get behind the appearances. We're going to be using our reasoning capacities to try to understand the way that things are. We're not going to assume that just because we've been told something that it's true. We're not going to assume that one philosopher or one view has all the answers. We're actually going to investigate and dig into all of these things and come to our own beliefs about how the world works and why. My goal in this class is not to give you what I think is an accurate picture of reality. Okay, I have my own ideas about things. I'm not going to try to express those to you at all. What I'm going to try to do is offer you a bunch of different perspectives on how things are, how things work, and why they work the way that they do. It's up to you to figure out what sounds good to you, what is a bad argument, what's a good argument, and what you're going to believe about things. Okay? All right, cool. Any final questions about the cave? Yes.
It's not a question. I think it's really cool. The puppeteers are kind of not unexplored but underexplored.
Yeah.
Like, I think he talks about like they walk around with like statues of man, and of course like people see the shadow of a man, it's not a man, but also like doing this behind the statue of a man makes it an angel, and that makes it the devil. And I think like they could be manipulating it even more than just seeing a shadow versus the real thing.
All right.
I thought that was cool.
Yeah. Do you think there are any shadow casters in our society?
Like for sure.
Right? Maybe I'm one.
Whoa, be chill.
Right. Don't take my word as gospel. Okay, you got to think about all this stuff on your own, right? Maybe I'm leading you into a particular framework so that I can use you later or something like that. I'm telling you that I'm not, but it's up to you to believe me. Okay. We'll stop there.